The aroma of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and pumpkin pie usually filled my home with warmth and anticipation on Thanksgiving Day. For 70 years, this holiday had been the cornerstone of my existence, a sacred ritual passed down through generations. My mother, God rest her soul, taught me the secret to a perfectly moist bird and the art of a truly flaky pie crust. I, in turn, passed these traditions to my son, Michael, and hoped his wife, Brenda, would embrace them with the same love. This year, however, the air was thick not just with the scent of spices, but with an unspoken tension, a brittle silence that hummed beneath the forced smiles and polite chatter. I had woken before dawn, my old bones protesting slightly, but my spirit alight with purpose. The house, a testament to decades of memories, was meticulously cleaned, every surface gleaming, every cushion fluffed. The antique dining table, polished to a mirror shine, was set with my finest china, the delicate porcelain with the gold rim, a wedding gift from my own grandmother, reserved only for the most special occasions. Each plate, each silver fork, held a story, a whisper of laughter and love from Thanksgivings past. I had spent days preparing not just the feast, but the atmosphere. The cranberries simmered with orange zest, their tart sweetness a counterpoint to the rich gravy. The sweet potato casserole, topped with toasted marshmallows, bubbled invitingly. Every dish was a labor of love, a tangible expression of my devotion to my family. Michael and Brenda arrived first, their 2 children, my beloved grandchildren, Emily and Daniel, trailing behind them. Emily, a bright-eyed 10-year-old, immediately ran to me, her arms wrapping around my waist in a tight hug. "Grandma, it smells amazing," she exclaimed, her voice a pure melody. Daniel, a more reserved 13-year-old, offered a shy smile and a quick, "Hi, Grandma." These moments, these simple gestures of affection, were my lifeblood. They were why I continued to pour my heart into these gatherings, why I endured the subtle slights and the increasingly overt dismissals that had become a disturbing undercurrent in my relationship with Michael and Brenda. Brenda, however, offered no such warmth. She swept into the dining room, her eyes scanning the meticulously set table, a faint, almost imperceptible sneer playing on her lips. "Eleanor, you really went all out again," she said, her tone flat, devoid of genuine appreciation. "It was a statement, not a compliment. Are you sure you didn't overdo it? You know your back isn't what it used to be." Her words, ostensibly concerned, felt like a veiled criticism, a reminder of my age, a subtle jab at my perceived frailty. I simply smiled, a practiced mask I had perfected over the years. "Nonsense, dear. It's Thanksgiving. It's what I do." The rest of the family trickled in, my sister Carol and her husband, my niece Sarah and her family. The house, usually so quiet, now buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. I moved through the kitchen, a whirlwind of activity, carving the golden brown turkey, arranging the platters, ensuring everything was perfect. My heart swelled with a familiar joy, a deep satisfaction that came from seeing my family gathered under my roof, sharing a meal I had lovingly prepared. This was my legacy, my contribution, my purpose. As I carried the last platter, the steaming green bean casserole, to the dining table, I overheard Brenda's voice, sharp and dismissive. "Honestly, Michael, I don't know why she insists on doing all this. It's so old-fashioned. We could just order catering next year. It would be so much easier." My steps faltered. The words, though not directed at me, pierced through my carefully constructed facade of happiness. Michael's response was a mumbled, non-committal sound, a typical reaction when caught between his wife and his mother. He rarely stood up to Brenda, a fact that had become a growing source of pain and disappointment for me. I placed the casserole on the table, forcing a bright smile. "Everything's ready. Please, everyone, find your seats." The family began to settle, the scraping of chairs against the polished floor filling the momentary silence. I watched as Brenda took her seat at the head of the table, a place I had always occupied, a place of honor. Michael sat beside her, and my heart sank a little. It was a small detail, seemingly insignificant, but it spoke volumes. It was another subtle shift, another quiet erosion of my place, my authority, my very identity within this family. I found an empty seat near the foot of the table, next to Emily and Daniel, who immediately began whispering excitedly about the food. Their innocence was a balm to my wounded spirit. I looked around the table at the faces of my loved ones, and a wave of nostalgia washed over me. So many Thanksgivings, so many memories. The laughter, the stories, the shared moments of joy and sorrow. Had it all changed so irrevocably? The meal began. Polite conversation flowed, punctuated by the clinking of silverware and the occasional burst of laughter. I tried to engage, to contribute, to be the matriarch I had always been. I asked Carol about her garden, Sarah about her children's school. But my words often seemed to get lost in the din, or were met with perfunctory responses before the conversation shifted back to topics I found myself increasingly excluded from: new technologies, social media trends, vacation plans that never seemed to include me. Brenda, meanwhile, held court at the head of the table. She spoke loudly, confidently, dominating the conversation. She recounted stories of her work, her friends, her latest achievements, all while barely acknowledging my presence. Michael, usually so attentive to me, was engrossed in conversation with Brenda, occasionally nodding or offering a brief comment. It felt as though I was an observer at my own Thanksgiving dinner, a silent guest in my own home. My plate, piled high with turkey, stuffing, and all the trimmings, sat before me. I had taken extra care to make sure everyone had enough, that no one was left wanting. As I reached for a spoonful of gravy, Brenda's voice cut through the air, sharp and accusatory. "Eleanor, what is this?" she demanded, her voice rising, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. I looked up, startled. "What is what, dear?" She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at her plate, specifically at a small, almost imperceptible brown spot on the rim of the china. It was a speck, no larger than a pinhead, likely a tiny piece of dried gravy from the serving spoon, easily wiped away. "This," she practically shrieked, her face contorting into a mask of disgust. "This is dirt. On my plate. How could you be so careless? I knew it was a mistake to let you handle the good china. You're too old for this. You can barely see straight." A hush fell over the table. All eyes turned to me, then to Brenda, then back to me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. The blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling cold and exposed. "Brenda, darling, it's just a tiny speck," Michael interjected, his voice weak, a mere whisper of protest. "Mother worked so hard." "Hard?" Brenda scoffed, cutting him off. Her eyes, usually a cool blue, blazed with an almost manic fury. "Hard to ruin our Thanksgiving? Hard to make us look like we eat off dirty dishes? This is unacceptable, Eleanor. Absolutely unacceptable." Before I could even formulate a response, before I could explain that it was just a tiny, easily remedied spot, before I could point out the years of care I had given that very china, Brenda snatched her plate from the table. The delicate porcelain, a family heirloom, felt fragile in her enraged grip. Her arm drew back, and in a horrifyingly slow motion, she slammed the plate down onto the table with a sickening crack. The sound echoed through the stunned silence, a violent punctuation mark on the holiday. Shards of porcelain flew, some narrowly missing Emily, who gasped and instinctively recoiled. The beautiful gold-rimmed plate, once a symbol of continuity and tradition, lay shattered, its pieces scattered amidst the turkey and stuffing, a grotesque tableau of destruction. My breath caught in my throat. My vision blurred. It wasn't just a plate. It was decades of memories, shattered in an instant. It was my effort, my love, my very being, reduced to fragments. "Old hag!" Brenda screamed, her voice raw with contempt, her face inches from mine. "Get out of my life. You are nothing but a burden, a relic. I'm sick of your old-fashioned ways, your endless nagging, your constant need for attention. Just disappear." The words, sharp and venomous, struck me with the force of a physical blow. "Old hag." The phrase reverberated in my ears, bouncing off the walls of my mind, each syllable a hammer blow to my soul. My own daughter-in-law, the woman who married my only son, the mother of my grandchildren, had just called me an old hag and told me to get out of her life. In my own home, on Thanksgiving. A profound silence descended upon the dining room, heavier and more suffocating than any I had ever experienced. No one spoke. No one moved. My sister Carol looked aghast, her hand flying to her mouth. My niece Sarah had tears welling in her eyes. But Michael just sat there, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the shattered plate, utterly paralyzed. He did not defend me. He did not rebuke his wife. He simply sat, a silent accomplice to this public humiliation. My eyes, wide with shock and unshed tears, met Brenda's. Her chest heaved, her nostrils flared, but there was no remorse in her gaze, only a chilling, triumphant defiance. She had done it. She had finally unleashed the full force of her contempt, and she felt no shame. A tremor ran through my body. My hands, which had so lovingly prepared this meal, now shook uncontrollably. The warmth of the kitchen, the festive atmosphere, the joy I had felt just moments before, all of it evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow ache in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just about a broken plate or a harsh word. This was an assault on my dignity, a brutal declaration of my perceived worthlessness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to lash out, to demand an apology, to ask Michael how he could sit there and let this happen. But no words came. My throat was constricted, my vocal cords paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the depth of the malice, the casual cruelty that had just been unleashed. Emily, bless her heart, was the first to break the silence. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Why did you do that to Grandma's plate?" Brenda merely shot her a withering glare. "Stay out of this, Emily. Your grandmother is being dramatic." Dramatic. That was her word for my pain, for my humiliation. I slowly pushed back my chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, a jarring sound in the oppressive silence. My gaze swept across the faces at the table. My sister, looking helpless. My niece, offering a sympathetic but ultimately silent plea. And Michael, my son, my only child, who could not meet my eyes. His silence was a scream louder than Brenda's. It was a confirmation of her words, a tacit agreement that I was, indeed, an old hag, a burden to be discarded. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to stand. My 70 years suddenly felt like a crushing weight, each one adding to the burden of this moment. I looked down at the shattered china, at the ruined meal, at the remnants of my Thanksgiving dream. A single tear, hot and stinging, finally escaped and traced a path down my wrinkled cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of profound, bitter disappointment. I think I need to lie down," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse with unshed emotion. I didn't wait for a response. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape, for solitude, for a place where the echoes of Brenda's words could not reach me. I turned and walked slowly, deliberately, out of the dining room, past the stunned faces, past the ruined feast. Each step was an effort, each movement a testament to the emotional wreckage I felt. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I refused to look back. I refused to give Brenda the satisfaction of seeing my complete breakdown. As I ascended the stairs, the familiar creak of the old wood beneath my feet seemed to mock me, a reminder of all the years I had spent in this house, building a life, a family, only to have it crumble around me in a single, brutal moment. I reached my bedroom, the sanctuary I had always cherished, and closed the door softly behind me. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, offering a stark contrast to the bright, festive chaos downstairs. I walked to the window, pulled back the heavy velvet, and stared out at the fading afternoon light. The autumn leaves, once vibrant, now lay scattered and brittle on the lawn, mirroring the fragments of my heart. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the soft mattress offering little comfort to my aching spirit. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. Old hag. The words replayed in my mind, a cruel, relentless loop. Had I truly become that? Was I nothing more than a burden, an inconvenience, a relic of a bygone era? My mind drifted back to the early days of Michael and Brenda's marriage. Brenda had always been a little sharp, ambitious, driven, with a clear idea of what she wanted and little patience for anything that stood in her way. I had initially admired her tenacity, her fierce independence. I had even tried to build a bond with her, to welcome her into our family with open arms. I taught her my recipes, shared stories of Michael's childhood, offered advice when she asked for it. Or, rather, when I thought she might need it. Perhaps that was where I went wrong. Perhaps my offers of help, my attempts to share my wisdom, were perceived as interference. I remembered the time I had gently suggested a different way to fold laundry, a method that saved space. Brenda had snapped, "I know how to fold laundry, Eleanor." I'm not a child. The sting of her words had surprised me then, but I had dismissed it as a momentary irritation, a sign of her youthful independence. Over the years, these small incidents had accumulated, like tiny pebbles in a shoe, unnoticed at first, then becoming increasingly uncomfortable. My opinions were brushed aside. My suggestions were met with thinly veiled disdain. My presence at family gatherings became less about inclusion and more about obligation. I saw it in their hurried goodbyes, their evasive answers when I asked about their plans, the way they would sometimes speak in hushed tones when I entered a room. But never, not once, had it escalated to this. Never had the contempt been so open, so raw, so utterly devastating. The shattered plate was not just an object, it was a symbol. A symbol of the breaking of our family bond, of the violent dismissal of my worth. I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea washing over me. The image of Brenda's contorted face, her blazing eyes, her venomous words, was burned into my memory. And Michael. His silent capitulation was perhaps even more painful. My son, my flesh and blood, had chosen his wife over his mother. Or, more accurately, he had chosen to do nothing, which was, in itself, a choice. A choice to abandon me in my moment of deepest humiliation. The silence of my room was a stark contrast to the imagined sounds of the party downstairs. Were they still eating? Were they laughing? Had they simply moved on, pretending that nothing had happened, that I, Eleanor, the matriarch, the host, had not just been publicly shamed and banished from my own table? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. I remembered all the sacrifices I had made for Michael. The sleepless nights when he was a baby, the endless hours spent helping him with his homework, the financial struggles I endured after his father passed away to ensure he had everything he needed. I had poured my entire life into him, into this family. And this was my reward. Old hag. Get out of my life. A profound sense of loneliness settled over me, heavy and suffocating. It was a loneliness I had never truly experienced before, not even after my husband's death. Then, there had been grief, but also the comforting presence of Michael, the shared memories, the certainty of his love. Now, that certainty had been brutally ripped away. I was alone, truly alone, in a house that no longer felt like a home, surrounded by people who no longer felt like family. My mind, usually so clear and organized, felt like a tangled mess of emotions. Anger, raw and burning, surged through me, quickly followed by a crushing wave of despair. How could I have been so blind? How could I have allowed this to happen? Had I been too kind? Too accommodating? Too eager to please? I thought of my friends, my bridge group, my book club. They would be horrified. They would offer sympathy, outrage on my behalf. But what good would that do? It wouldn't change the cold, hard truth of what had just transpired. It wouldn't mend the shattered pieces of my dignity. The sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across my room. The chill in the air seemed to seep into my bones, a physical manifestation of the emotional coldness that had enveloped me. I pulled a knitted shawl around my shoulders, but it offered no warmth. I lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the evening replayed in my mind, a relentless loop of humiliation. Brenda's face, her words, the sound of the shattering plate. Each detail was etched into my memory, a painful reminder of my vulnerability, my powerlessness. A new emotion began to stir within me, slowly, tentatively, pushing through the layers of pain and despair. It was a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. It was resentment. A deep, simmering resentment that began to harden the edges of my grief. Old hag, she had called me. A hag. A witch. Someone to be feared, perhaps. Someone with power. The thought, fleeting at first, began to take root. What if I wasn't just an old woman to be discarded? What if I had power she didn't know about? What if her contempt had just awakened something dormant within me? The idea was a fragile seed, planted in the fertile ground of my humiliation. It offered a tiny spark of defiance in the vast darkness of my despair. I had always been a gentle soul, a peacemaker, someone who avoided conflict at all costs. But what had that gotten me? A shattered plate and a public shaming. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. Perhaps it was time to stop being this sweet old grandma and start being something else. Something stronger. Something that would make Brenda regret her words. The thought, though vague, brought a strange sense of calm. The tears had stopped. The trembling had subsided. A cold, quiet resolve began to settle over me. I didn't know what I would do or how I would do it. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter, one where the old hag would finally find her voice and, perhaps, her revenge. I lay there for hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the party downstairs, the distant laughter, the clinking of glasses. Each sound was a reminder of my exclusion, my banishment. But now it no longer brought tears. It brought a growing sense of detachment, a chilling clarity. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had won. But they were wrong. They had merely awakened something they could not possibly comprehend. The game had changed. And I, Eleanor, the old hag, was ready to play. The night after Thanksgiving was the longest of my life. I lay in bed, the shattered remnants of my grandmother's china plate echoing in the silence of my room, each fragment a sharp jab to my heart. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, Brenda's contorted face, her venomous words, and the sickening crack of porcelain replayed in a relentless loop. Old hag, get out of my life. The phrases had burrowed deep into my consciousness, festering like an open wound. My initial shock had given way to a searing pain, which in turn slowly transformed into a cold, hard knot of something unfamiliar, a quiet, simmering rage. I had always prided myself on my composure, my ability to navigate life's storms with grace and dignity. My late husband, Arthur, used to say I was the calmest person he knew, a steady anchor in any tempest. But that night, the anchor had been ripped from its moorings. I felt adrift, betrayed, and utterly alone. The thought of Michael's silence, his failure to defend me, was a fresh wave of nausea. My son, my only child, for whom I had sacrificed so much, had stood by and watched as his wife publicly humiliated me in my own home. It was a betrayal far deeper than Brenda's outburst, for it spoke of a love that had withered, a bond that had frayed beyond recognition. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and gray, I finally rose. My body ached, not just from the physical strain of the previous day's preparations, but from the emotional battering. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with lines of profound sorrow etched around my mouth. But beneath the weariness, I saw a flicker, a tiny spark in my eyes that had not been there before. It was the spark of defiance, of a nascent resolve. I had spent my life being gentle, accommodating, putting the needs of others before my own. And what had it earned me? Contempt. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple, dark dress that mirrored my mood. There would be no more elaborate meals, no more grand gestures of love that were met with disdain. From this day forward, things would be different. I did not know how or what shape this change would take, but the conviction settled deep within my bones. I descended the stairs, bracing myself for the inevitable awkwardness, the forced apologies, or, more likely, the complete avoidance of the previous day's events. The house was eerily quiet. The dining room, usually bustling with the sounds of breakfast after a holiday, was empty. The shattered plate, however, remained where it had fallen, a stark, brutal reminder. No one had bothered to clean it up. It lay there, a testament to Brenda's rage and the family's indifference. A fresh wave of indignation washed over me. Not only had they humiliated me, but they had also left the wreckage for me to deal with. It was another subtle act of disrespect, a quiet declaration that my feelings, my home, my very presence held no value. With trembling hands, I retrieved a dustpan and brush from the kitchen and carefully swept up the fragments, each shard a painful memory. I wrapped them in an old dishcloth and placed them in the trash, a symbolic burial of a cherished past. Later that morning, Michael finally emerged from his bedroom, looking rumpled and avoiding my gaze. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, heading straight for the coffee maker. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the previous night's horror. It was as if it had never happened. "Good morning, Michael," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "Did you sleep well?" He shrugged, still not looking at me. "Yeah, fine. Brenda's still asleep." He paused, then, as if forced by some invisible hand, added, "Look, Mom, about last night. Brenda was just stressed. You know how she gets." "Stressed?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Is that what you call smashing a family heirloom and screaming obscenities at your mother in her own home?" He finally met my eyes, a flicker of discomfort in his gaze. "Mom, please. Let's not make a big deal out of it. It's Thanksgiving, we should be happy." She didn't mean it. She didn't mean to call me an old hag and tell me to get out of her life? I pressed, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to remain composed. She didn't mean to shatter a plate that belonged to my grandmother? "Michael, do you even hear yourself?" He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Mom, you're being dramatic. It was just a plate. We can get you a new one." "It was just a plate?" The words were a bitter taste in my mouth. "It was a symbol, Michael. A symbol of everything that has been eroding between us. Of your wife's contempt and your silence." He averted his gaze again, retreating into his usual passive-aggressive silence. "Look, I'm going to take the kids out for breakfast. We need to get some air." He didn't invite me. He didn't even suggest we talk further. He simply turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the echoes of our hollow conversation hanging in the air. The days that followed Thanksgiving were a blur of quiet suffering and growing clarity. Brenda's behavior, far from improving, became even more pronounced. She moved through my house as if she owned it, barely acknowledging my presence, her voice often raised in sharp commands to Michael or the children. She would leave her belongings scattered, expecting me to pick them up, and would often comment on my old-fashioned furniture or cluttered decor. "Eleanor, do you really need all these knickknacks?" she'd ask, gesturing vaguely at my cherished collection of porcelain figurines. "It makes the house feel so heavy and dusty." I would simply nod, my heart aching, and retreat to my room, the only place where I felt a semblance of peace. My house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a battleground, a territory being slowly encroached upon. One afternoon, I found Brenda in my study, going through my old photo albums. These were precious to me, filled with memories of Arthur, of Michael as a boy, of family vacations and milestones. She held one album open, a look of disdain on her face. "Good heavens, Eleanor, look at these clothes," she exclaimed, pointing at a picture of me in my younger days. "Did people really dress like that? It's so dowdy." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound that grated on my nerves. "Those are my memories, Brenda," I said, my voice tight. "Please, be careful with them." She merely shrugged. "Oh, don't be so sensitive. It's just old pictures. Honestly, you cling to the past so much. It's unhealthy." She snapped the album shut and tossed it back onto the shelf with a thud, scattering a few loose photos. She didn't bother to pick them up. The casual disrespect, the utter disregard for my feelings, was a constant, insidious strip. It wasn't just the big blow-ups, it was the 1,000 tiny cuts, the daily reminders that I was no longer valued, no longer seen as a person with feelings, memories, or dignity. I was merely an inconvenience, a burden, an old hag. My grandchildren, Emily and Daniel, were my only solace. Emily, with her innocent questions and loving hugs, would often sneak into my room to read with me or tell me about her day. Daniel, though quieter, would sometimes sit with me while I watched television, offering a comforting presence. They seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, the growing tension, and their small acts of kindness were a lifeline. But even their interactions with me were often curtailed by Brenda. "Emily, leave your grandmother alone," Brenda would snap. "She needs her rest. Go play with your brother." Or, "Daniel, don't bother Grandma with your silly questions. She's busy." It was a subtle but effective way of isolating me, of cutting off my only remaining source of familial warmth. I began to spend more and more time in my room, reading, knitting, staring out the window. The vibrant woman I once was, the woman who hosted lively bridge games and volunteered at the local library, felt like a distant memory. I was shrinking, fading, becoming the old hag they perceived me to be. The internal conflict was agonizing. Part of me wanted to fight, to scream, to demand the respect I deserved. Another part, the part that had been conditioned by a lifetime of politeness and self-sacrifice, wanted to simply disappear, to avoid further confrontation, further pain. The thought of moving out, of finding my own place, had crossed my mind. But this house, my home for over 40 years, was filled with Arthur's presence, with the echoes of Michael's childhood. It was my anchor, my history. The idea of leaving it, of abandoning these memories, felt like another form of surrender. Besides, where would I go? My pension was modest, and the thought of navigating the complexities of finding a new place, managing utilities, and setting up a new life felt overwhelming. I was 70, not 20. The world felt like a much colder, more unforgiving place outside these familiar walls. One evening, I overheard Brenda and Michael discussing my finances. They thought I was in my room, but I had just come down for a glass of water. Their voices, hushed but audible, carried from the living room. "Honestly, Michael, her pension barely covers the bills," Brenda said, her voice laced with exasperation. "And this house? It's a money pit. The roof needs repairs, the plumbing is ancient. It's a huge burden." I know, Michael replied, his voice sounding tired. "But what are we supposed to do?" "She won't hear of selling it." "She has to," Brenda insisted. "It's not practical. She's getting older, she can't manage it anymore. We should just put it on the market. Get a good price for it, and then she can move into a nice assisted living facility. Something modern, with all the amenities." My blood ran cold. Assisted living. They were discussing putting me in a home. Without even asking me. Without a single conversation. It was a complete disregard for my autonomy, my wishes, my very right to decide my own future. My home, my sanctuary, was merely a money pit to them, an asset to be liquidated for their convenience. "Brenda, she'll never agree," Michael said, sounding hesitant. "She doesn't have a choice," Brenda retorted, her voice hardening. "We're doing this for her own good. She's getting forgetful, she's frail. It's for her safety. And besides," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "think of the equity. We could finally put a down payment on that bigger house we've been wanting." The conversation continued, their voices blending into a low hum of casual cruelty. They were planning my future, dissecting my life, all for their own benefit. I retreated silently back to my room, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a new, potent surge of fury. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was about control. About taking away my independence, my home, my very existence as an autonomous individual. The next day, I called my sister Carol. Carol was 2 years younger than me, but always the more pragmatic and outspoken of us. We had always been close, sharing secrets and supporting each other through life's trials. I hadn't told her the full extent of Brenda's outburst on Thanksgiving, fearing she would worry too much. But now I knew I couldn't keep silent any longer. "Carol," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you." "Really talk?" I recounted the entire Thanksgiving incident, the shattered plate, Brenda's words, Michael's silence. I described the subsequent days of casual cruelty, the dismissals, the constant feeling of being an unwanted guest in my own home. And finally, I told her about the overheard conversation, their plans to sell my house and put me in an assisted living facility. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Carol's voice, usually so cheerful, was tight with suppressed anger. "Eleanor, why didn't you tell me this sooner? That woman is a monster. And Michael. Michael should be ashamed of himself. How could he let her treat you like that?" "I don't know, Carol," I whispered, tears finally welling in my eyes. I didn't want to believe it. I kept hoping it was just a phase, that she would change. That Michael would finally stand up for me. "Eleanor, listen to me," Carol said, her voice firm, cutting through my despair. "You are not a burden. You are not an old hag. You are my sister, and you are a wonderful, kind, strong woman. And you deserve to be treated with respect. This cannot stand." Her words were a lifeline, a desperately needed affirmation in a sea of self-doubt. "But what can I do, Carol? They're my family. It's my son." "Exactly," Carol said. "And because he's your son, he should be protecting you, not letting that harridan walk all over you. You can't let them do this, Eleanor. You cannot let them take your home, your independence. You have to fight back." Fight back? The words felt alien on my tongue. I had never fought anyone in my life. "Yes, fight back." Carol's voice was resolute. "Not with anger, Eleanor. With smarts. With dignity. You have resources, don't you? You're not destitute. You have your pension, your savings. And you have this house, which is yours, free and clear." Her words sparked a tiny flame of hope within me. Yes, I had my pension. And I had a small nest egg, carefully saved over decades, tucked away in a separate account, one that Michael and Brenda knew nothing about. It was my emergency fund, a secret I had kept even from Arthur, a small measure of security for my old age. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to give me options. Options they didn't know I had. I do have some savings, Carol, I admitted. Not much, but some. Good. Carol exclaimed. That's a start. Now listen. You need to start thinking. What do you want? Do you want to stay in that house? Do you want to move? What would make you happy? The question hung in the air. What did I want? For so long, my wants had been subsumed by the needs of my family. Now, faced with the prospect of losing everything, a new desire, fierce and undeniable, began to take shape. I wanted my dignity back. I wanted my independence. And I wanted them to understand, truly understand, the consequences of their actions. I want my life back, Carol, I said, my voice stronger now. I want to be free. And I want them to realize what they've done. Exactly, Carol said. And you will. But you have to be smart about it. Don't let them see you're planning anything. Be quiet. Observe. And when the time is right, you make your move. And I'll be right here with you every step of the way. Her unwavering support was a powerful tonic. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a glimmer of something other than despair. I felt a sense of purpose. I felt a nascent strength stirring within me, a resolve born from the ashes of humiliation. Over the next few days, I began to observe Brenda and Michael with new eyes. I noticed the way Brenda would subtly manipulate Michael, her casual dismissals of his opinions, her constant need to be in control. I saw Michael's weariness, his desire to avoid conflict at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing his mother's dignity. They were a unit, bound by a shared desire for comfort and convenience, and a casual disregard for anyone who stood in their way. I also noticed their spending habits. Brenda was obsessed with appearances, with designer clothes, expensive cars, lavish vacations. Michael, though less extravagant, never seemed to question her spending. They lived beyond their means, always chasing the next big thing, always complaining about their lack of money, despite Michael's respectable salary. It was clear they were counting on something, perhaps the equity in my house, to fund their increasingly lavish lifestyle. I started making subtle inquiries. I called a real estate agent, pretending to be interested in selling my house for a friend. I learned the market value, the potential profit. It was a substantial sum, far more than I had anticipated. The thought of them getting their hands on that money, after everything they had done, sent a fresh jolt of anger through me. I also discreetly researched assisted living facilities. The brochures depicted cheerful, vibrant communities, but the reality, I knew, was often far different. And the cost? It was exorbitant. It confirmed my suspicion. They weren't planning to put me in a nice facility for my safety. They were planning to get rid of me, to free up my house, and to use the proceeds for their own benefit. The more I observed, the more I learned, the clearer their motives became. It wasn't just thoughtlessness or insensitivity. It was a calculated plan, a slow, insidious attempt to strip me of my independence and my assets. And the more I understood, the stronger my resolve became. I began to make secret phone calls, discreetly gathering information. I spoke to an old friend who was a retired lawyer, asking hypothetical questions about property rights and wills. I contacted my bank, inquiring about transferring funds, about setting up new accounts. Each call, each piece of information, was a small victory, a tiny step towards reclaiming my power. My internal world, once consumed by grief and despair, was now filled with a quiet hum of strategic thought. I was no longer the passive victim. I was a strategist, a planner, a woman with a purpose. The old hag was learning new tricks, and her adversaries had no idea what was coming. The calm that had settled over me was not the calm of resignation, but the calm of anticipation. The storm was brewing, and I was no longer afraid of it. In fact, I was ready to unleash it. I still ate meals with them, still offered polite conversation, still played the role of the quiet, slightly frail grandmother. But beneath the surface, a steel resolve had formed. I watched Brenda's every move, listened to her every word, analyzing, dissecting. I saw her arrogance, her certainty that she had won, that I was a defeated old woman. And I smiled inwardly, a small, secret smile that no one could see. They had underestimated me. And that, I knew, would be their biggest mistake. The game was far from over. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening, a vacuum where moments before, their smug certainty had resided. Brenda's face, usually a canvas of calculated expressions, was a chaotic mess of disbelief, fury, and a dawning horror. Michael, my son, stood frozen, his mouth agape, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he had just witnessed a ghost. The crisp document, the deed to my home, felt like a thunderbolt in my hand, its silent power now unleashed. What are you talking about, Eleanor? Brenda finally stammered, her voice a strangled whisper, utterly devoid of its usual sharp authority. You can't do that. This is your house. It's impossible. Impossible? I repeated, a cold, quiet satisfaction spreading through me. My dear Brenda, it is not only possible, it is done. As of this morning, the deed has been officially transferred. This house, which you so eagerly planned to sell for your own gain, now belongs to the Eleanor Vance Home for Displaced Seniors, a non-profit organization, a charity. Brenda's eyes darted wildly from me to Michael, then back to me, as if searching for a loophole, a trick, a way to undo the irreversible. Michael, do something. She's lost her mind. She can't just give away her property. It's fraud. Michael, however, remained rooted to the spot, his face pale, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. He looked utterly defeated, a puppet whose strings had been abruptly cut. Mom, why? He finally managed, his voice hoarse, barely audible. How could you do this? How could I do this, Michael? I echoed, the bitterness in my voice sharp and clear. How could you let your wife call me an old hag and tell me to get out of her life? How could you sit by while she shattered my grandmother's china? How could you plan to throw me out of my home and into an assisted living facility, all for your own financial gain, without a single word of consultation? You ask me how I could do this? I ask you, Michael, how could you do what you did? My words, delivered with a calm, unwavering conviction, seemed to pierce through his shock, striking him with the force of a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes finally meeting mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of the old Michael, a glimmer of shame and regret. But it was quickly replaced by a desperate, self-serving anger. This is insane, Mom. He blurted out, his voice rising in desperation. You're 70 years old. You can't just give away your entire estate. We're your family. We're supposed to inherit this house. Inherit? I scoffed, a dry, mirthless laugh escaping my lips. You were counting on an inheritance, were you? An inheritance from the old hag you planned to discard? This house, Michael, was built on love, on sacrifice, on memories. It was never meant to be a cash cow for those who treat others with contempt. Brenda, recovering her voice, shrieked, "You manipulative old woman. You planned this. You've been plotting against us." Plotting? I raised an eyebrow, a newfound coolness in my demeanor. I was simply protecting myself, Brenda. Protecting my home, my dignity, and my future from those who sought to strip me of everything. You taught me a valuable lesson on Thanksgiving Day. You taught me that I could no longer rely on your kindness or Michael's loyalty. You taught me that I had to rely on myself. And so I did. I explained, calmly and meticulously, the legal steps I had taken. How Robert, my lawyer friend, had guided me through the process. How Sarah Chin, my financial advisor, had helped me secure my remaining assets and ensure my financial independence. I spoke of the nonprofit's mission, its dedication to providing a haven for seniors who, like me, faced exploitation and abandonment. As I spoke, their faces grew paler, their expressions shifting from anger to a dawning, terrifying realization of the magnitude of their loss. The Board of Trustees for the Eleanor Vance Home for Displaced Seniors will be taking possession of the property next week, I announced, my voice firm. They will be overseeing the renovations necessary to convert it into a comfortable residence for its future occupants. You will, of course, need to vacate the premises by then. Vacate? Brenda shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. This is our home. We live here. You live here as my guests, Brenda, I corrected, my gaze unwavering. And as of this moment, your invitation has been rescinded. You have exactly 7 days to remove your belongings. Anything left after that will be considered a donation to the trust. Michael finally found his voice, a desperate plea. Mom, please. Don't do this. Where will we go? We don't have anywhere else. That, Michael, I said, a profound sadness mingling with my resolve, is a consequence of your own choices. You chose to prioritize greed and contempt over family. You chose to abandon your mother. Now, you must live with the consequences of those choices. I then turned and walked away, leaving them standing amidst the wreckage of their shattered expectations. I didn't look back. The air in the room, once thick with their oppressive presence, now felt lighter, freer. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity, but this time, it was a whirlwind of my making. Robert and Sarah Chin handled all the legal and financial aspects, ensuring a smooth transition. The board members of the newly formed trust, a group of compassionate and dedicated individuals, arrived to begin assessing the house. I watched with a quiet sense of triumph as they walked through the rooms, discussing plans for renovations, for creating a warm and welcoming environment for future residents. My home, once a source of pain, was now transforming into a beacon of hope for others. Brenda and Michael, meanwhile, were in a state of utter chaos. Their frantic phone calls to lawyers yielded no results. Robert had ensured every legal avenue was sealed tight. Their desperate pleas to me were met with a polite but firm refusal to engage. I had moved my personal belongings, my cherished memories, into a small, comfortable apartment I had secretly rented weeks ago, a cozy sanctuary away from their toxic presence. The public humiliation, though not orchestrated by me, began to unfold naturally. My sister Carol, who had been a rock of support throughout this ordeal, subtly let slip to other family members and mutual acquaintances what had transpired. The news spread like wildfire through our social circles. The story of Brenda's outburst, Michael's abandonment, and my unexpected, decisive move became the talk of the town. The whispers, the averted gazes, the polite but pointed questions, all contributed to Brenda and Michael's rapidly eroding reputation. They, who had always prided themselves on their social standing and their image of the perfect family, found themselves ostracized, their true nature exposed for all to see. Their financial situation, already precarious due to Brenda's extravagant spending and their reliance on the house's equity, quickly deteriorated. Without the anticipated windfall from the sale of my home, They were forced to confront the harsh reality of their over-leveraged lifestyle. They had to sell their expensive cars, downsize to a much smaller, less desirable rental apartment, and significantly cut back on their lavish expenditures. The dream of their bigger, more luxurious home vanished like smoke. I heard through Carol that Brenda was constantly complaining, blaming me for all their misfortunes, while Michael retreated further into himself, a shadow of his former self. I, on the other hand, flourished. My new apartment, though smaller than my old house, felt like a palace of freedom. It was filled with my favorite books, my knitting supplies, and the few precious pieces of furniture that held deep sentimental value. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful, a canvas for my own thoughts and dreams. I reconnected with my bridge group and book club, their warmth and genuine affection a soothing balm to my soul. I started volunteering at a local community center, sharing my love for reading with children. I even took up painting, a hobby I had always dreamed of pursuing, but never had the time for. My days were filled with purpose, with joy, with the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The Eleanor Vance Home for Displaced Seniors quickly became a reality. The renovations were completed, and within a few months, the first residents moved in. I visited often, not as the owner, but as a benefactor and a friend. Seeing the faces of those who had found refuge and dignity within its walls filled me with a profound sense of accomplishment. My old home, once a place of pain, was now a sanctuary for others, a testament to resilience and compassion. It was a legacy far more meaningful than any material inheritance. One afternoon, a few months after I had moved out, I received a phone call. It was Michael. His voice was hesitant, almost pleading. "Mom? Can we talk? We're having some financial difficulties. Brenda lost her job, and we're really struggling." A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. This was it. The moment I had anticipated. They were coming back, seeking help, expecting me to bail them out. "Michael," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I am sorry to hear that you are struggling. But my financial affairs are now entirely separate, and my resources are dedicated to the trust." "But Mom, we're your family," he pleaded, a hint of desperation in his voice. "Don't you care about us?" "I cared, Michael," I replied, a profound sadness in my tone. "I cared deeply. I cared enough to give you my entire life, my love, my support. But you and Brenda chose to discard that care. You chose to treat me as a burden, as an old hag to be removed. You chose to take everything from me. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, Michael's voice, barely a whisper, We made a mistake, Mom. We were wrong." "Yes, Michael," I said, my voice softening slightly, but remaining firm. "You were. And I hope, truly hope, that you learn from it. But my path is now clear. My life is my own. And I will not allow it to be dictated by your mistakes any longer." I ended the call, my hand trembling slightly, but my heart resolute. It was not an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation. A final, definitive boundary. My relationship with Emily and Daniel, however, slowly began to heal. They would visit me at my new apartment, sometimes alone, sometimes with Carol. They saw the peace in my eyes, the joy in my demeanor. They saw the positive impact of the Eleanor Vance home, and I believe, in their young hearts, they began to understand the true meaning of dignity and respect. They never spoke of their parents' struggles, but their quiet presence, their loving hugs, spoke volumes. I knew that, in time, they would forge their own paths, hopefully learning from the painful lessons their parents had inadvertently taught them. My life was no longer defined by the expectations or contempt of others. It was defined by my own choices, my own strength, my own rediscovered purpose. The old hag had not just survived, she had triumphed. She had found her voice, reclaimed her dignity, and built a legacy that would continue to give back long after her own journey was complete. The shattered plate was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant tapestry of a life lived on my own terms, filled with freedom, peace, and the quiet, profound joy of knowing that I had finally, truly, come home to myself.